Let's get right into it. In Ontario, we have laws on the books that are supposed to protect people at work. But what happens when those laws just aren't enforced? We're going to dig into the massive gap between the rights you are promised and what's actually happening on the ground. So let me ask you this. Do you feel like your rights at work are truly protected? Most of us just assume they are. We figure there's a law, so there must be a system to back it up. We show up, we do our job, and we trust that the basics are being taken care of. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the safety net you think is there has some serious holes in it? What does that mean for you, for your paycheck, for your security? That's what we're here to unpack. To really get what's going wrong, we've got to first understand what was promised in the first place. And in Ontario, that promise starts with one really important law. This is the Employment Standards Act, or the ESA. And for the 73% of workers in Ontario who aren't part of a union, this is supposed to be the bedrock, the absolute floor for your rights, guaranteeing the bare minimum for pretty much everyone. But here's where we see the first big crack in the foundation. A lot of people, and frankly, a lot of employers, think these minimums are the be-all and end-all. And nowhere does this misunderstanding cost people more money than when it comes to severance pay. I bet you've heard this before. You might even believe it's true. It's what everyone seems to say when they get laid off. The problem is, it's not just wrong, it's a dangerously expensive misunderstanding. Okay, this slide is absolutely crucial. It breaks it all down. On the left, you've got the ESA. That's the simple, bare-bones formula. But on the right, you have what's called common law. This is what most non-union employees are actually entitled to. And it's not a simple formula. It looks at your age, your job, how long you worked there. The difference is just staggering. We're talking about up to 24 months' pay, not weeks, months. And here's the real kicker. If you go to the Ministry of Labor to file a claim, they are legally stuck. They can only help you get those minimum amounts under the ESA. They literally can't get you what you're owed under common law. So by going to the government for help, you could be leaving tens of thousands of dollars on the table without even realizing it. Now that whole confusion around severance, that's just one crack in the system. When you look at the data, you see something much more alarming. It's not just that the laws are misunderstood, it's that they're being broken on an industrial scale. It's easy to write this off as a few bad apple employers, right? The ones who are just trying to get away with something. But all the research, including the government's own numbers, paints a totally different picture. This isn't a few bad apples, it's a systemic problem. And wow, just look at this number, 77%. Let that sink in for a second. When the Ministry of Labor actually went out and did proactive inspections, targeting industries they knew were high risk, they found that more than 3/4 of the places they checked were breaking the law. In those sectors, it was the norm, not the exception. And this chart just hammers that point home. It shows where the most complaints actually come from. And what's at the top of the list? Accommodation and food services, retail, construction. It's a clear pattern. The industries that rely on precarious workers are where we see the most violations. All these violations, unpaid overtime, stolen tips, not getting your final pay, it all comes together under one powerful term, wage theft. And let's be crystal clear, this isn't some accounting mistake. It is money being illegally taken from a worker's pocket, and it is a massive, ongoing problem. Okay, so if violations are this widespread, what about that shield? What about the government body whose whole job is to enforce these laws? Well, this is where the story gets really, really troubling. First, the number of proactive inspections, where inspectors go looking for problems before a worker gets hurt, has completely cratered. Since 2018, these kinds of checks have dropped by 77%. The government is just not looking for violations nearly as often as it used to. Second, even when they do find a violation, the consequences have gotten much weaker. The most serious penalties, the kinds of fines that would actually make a company change its ways, have dropped by 85%. The message it sends is that even if you get caught, the punishment probably won't be that bad. And this number right here, this might be the most shocking one of all. Even when a worker does everything right, files a claim, and wins their case, when the government officially confirms their wages were stolen, the Ministry of Finance is only able to collect 22% of that money. That means nearly 4 out of every $5 in confirmed stolen wages is never ever paid back to the worker who earned it. So the obvious question is, how? How can the system be failing this badly? Well, the research points to a few fundamental flaws that are basically built right into its design. Okay, so there are a few core reasons.
First, the whole system is reactive. It just waits for a worker to complain instead of proactively stopping problems. That leads to the second issue, fear. The data shows 90% of all complaints are filed by people after they've already left their job. They're terrified of being fired, getting their hours cut, or facing other forms of retaliation. And then you throw in the fact that the number of inspectors hasn't kept up with how much Ontario's workforce has grown, and you've got a system that's just stretched way too thin to be a real threat to bad employers. So where does all this leave the average worker in Ontario? Well, it means you have to navigate a system where the promise on paper and the reality you experience can be two very, very different things. And this power imbalance doesn't go away just because you file a complaint. Look at this chart. It shows what happens when cases get settled. Those big gray bars on the left show that a huge chunk of cases are settled for less than half of what the worker was actually owed. Why? Because when you're facing a long, intimidating process and you urgently need money, you feel pressured to just take whatever you can get. So here's the bottom line. Your rights under the law are only as strong as the system that's there to enforce them. And in Ontario, the evidence makes it pretty clear that the system of enforcement is struggling, leaving millions of workers in a really vulnerable spot. Now, understanding these gaps isn't supposed to discourage you. It's meant to empower you. Knowing that the Employment Standards Act is only the absolute minimum and that you might be entitled to much more under common law, that's the first critical tool you have. Knowing that the government enforcement system has serious flaws is also crucial. So the question this leaves us with is this. Armed with this knowledge, what's the second step you need to take to truly protect yourself?